The kind of silence that settles over old photographs, the kind that hangs in the halls of abandoned buildings, where footsteps echo against marble floors that no longer remember their purpose. In the heart of Chicago, in the summer of 1893, something extraordinary rose from the shores of Lake Michigan. They called it the World's Columbian Exposition. A celebration of progress, they said, a testament to American ingenuity. But beneath the banners and the crowds, beneath the electric lights that illuminated the night sky, for the first time in human memory, there was something else, something that the official records never quite explained. The story begins with Marcus Holloway, a 63-year-old architectural historian who had spent his entire career studying the great buildings of the 19th century. For decades, he had walked through the halls of universities, teaching students about the evolution of American architecture. He had written books. He had given lectures. He had believed with unwavering certainty that he understood the history of the structures that defined the nation. But in the autumn of his career, Marcus stumbled upon something that would shatter everything he thought he knew. It started with a photograph. Marcus sat alone in his study in Boston, surrounded by towers of books and yellowed papers. The lamplight cast long shadows across the walls as he examined a collection of images from the 1893 World's Fair. He had seen these photographs hundreds of times before. The Court of Honor, the Palace of Fine Arts, the great domes that rose against the sky like monuments to a forgotten god. But this time, something caught his attention. He leaned closer to the image, adjusting his reading glasses. The photograph showed the central dome of the administration building designed by the architect Richard Morris Hunt. According to official records, this structure was temporary, built from a mixture of plaster, jute fiber, and cement known as staff. It was meant to last only for the duration of the fair, then be demolished like all the others. Yet Marcus noticed something he had never seen before. The proportions were wrong, not wrong in the sense of poor craftsmanship. Wrong in the sense of impossibility. The dome rose to a height of 275 feet, supported by columns that seemed far too slender for their burden. The geometry was precise, mathematical, almost musical in its perfection, and the construction time, according to the official timeline, was a mere 18 months. Marcus pulled another book from his shelf and began to calculate. He had spent his career studying 19th century construction techniques. He knew the limitations of the materials, the capabilities of the workforce, the logistics of such massive undertakings. And the numbers did not add up. For a structure of that size and complexity to be built in 18 months, using the technology available in 1893, would have required a workforce of impossible proportions. It would have demanded materials that could not have been transported in time. It would have necessitated engineering knowledge that simply did not exist. Unless, Marcus thought, the buildings were not built at all, unless they were already there. The thought came unbidden, almost ridiculous in its implications. He pushed it aside and returned to the photographs. But the question lingered, a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. Over the following weeks, Marcus began to dig deeper. He visited archives across the country, requesting access to original documents from the fair. He examined blueprints, construction logs, financial records, and with each new piece of evidence, his confusion only grew. The construction logs were incomplete. Entire sections were missing, as if pages had been deliberately removed. The financial records showed expenditures that did not match the official budget. And the blueprints, when he finally obtained them, revealed structural details that defied the engineering capabilities of the era. One evening, as Marcus sat in the reading room of the Library of Congress, he discovered a letter that had been misfiled for over a century. It was written by Daniel Burnham, the chief architect of the fair, addressed to a colleague whose name had been redacted. The letter was dated 3 months before the official groundbreaking ceremony. The letter read, "The structures are in better condition than we anticipated. With proper restoration, they will serve our purposes admirably. The public need never know the truth of their origin." Marcus read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly. The implications were staggering. If Burnham's words were to be believed, then the buildings of the World's Fair were not constructed at all. They were restored. They were already there, waiting to be revealed. But where did they come from? Who built them? And why had the truth been hidden for so long? Marcus knew he had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that powerful people had worked very hard to conceal, but he also knew that he could not turn back. The mystery had taken hold of him, and he would follow it wherever it led. He began to search for others who might share his questions. Through academic networks and late-night internet forums, he connected with a small community of researchers who had noticed similar anomalies in the historical record. There was Elena Vasquez, a young graduate student from Berkeley who had been investigating the impossible architecture of the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition. There was William Chen, a retired engineer from Seattle who had spent years analyzing the structural impossibilities of 19th-century train stations. And there was Catherine Mills, a photographer from New York who had dedicated her life to documenting the strange symmetries hidden within America's oldest buildings. Together, they formed an informal research collective, sharing their findings through encrypted emails and private video calls. They called themselves the Resonance Group, a name that would take on deeper meaning as their investigation progressed. Their research led them to a pattern that spanned the entire nation, from the grand rotundas of state capitals to the soaring domes of public libraries, from the ornate train stations of the East Coast to the mysterious exhibition buildings of world's fairs long forgotten. They found the same architectural signatures repeated again and again, proportions based on sacred geometry, materials that defied conventional analysis, construction timelines that seemed physically impossible, and at the center of it all, they found the domes. The great domed structures that rose above the American landscape were unlike anything else in the architectural record. They shared characteristics that transcended regional styles and historical periods. They exhibited acoustic properties that modern engineers struggled to replicate, and many of them had been built, according to official records, during periods of economic depression or civil war, when such ambitious construction projects should have been impossible. Marcus began to call them the Sky Domes, not because they reached toward the heavens, but because they seemed to belong to a different sky entirely, a sky from another time, another world, another civilization. The Resonance Group's investigation was just beginning, but already they sensed that they were approaching something vast and hidden, something that had been deliberately erased from the memory of humanity. The truth they would discover was far more extraordinary than any of them had imagined. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories that question everything you thought you knew about history captivate your mind and awaken your curiosity, then this is where you belong. Subscribe now, because what comes next will change how you see the world forever. Heat, the kind of heat that rises from summer asphalt and shimmers in the distance like a mirage. The kind that makes you question whether what you see is real or merely a trick of light and temperature. Marcus Holloway stood before the great dome of the San Francisco City Hall, his neck craned upward, his eyes tracing the impossible curves that rose above him. It was a Tuesday morning in late July, and the plaza was empty, save for a few homeless men sleeping beneath the scattered trees. The building seemed to watch him with silent patience, as if it had been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. According to official records, the current City Hall was constructed between 1913 and 1915, rising from the ashes of the original building that had been destroyed in the earthquake of 1906. The dome, modelled after St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, rose to a height of 307 feet, making it the fifth tallest dome in the world. The architect, Arthur Brown Jr., had created a masterpiece of Beaux-Arts design, a testament to San Francisco's resilience and ambition. But Marcus had stopped believing the official records months ago. He walked slowly around the building, photographing every detail, measuring every proportion he could reach. The stonework was immaculate, carved with a precision that seemed almost inhuman. The columns rose with mathematical perfection, their capitals adorned with symbols that did not quite match any classical tradition. And the dome itself, that magnificent curve of copper and steel, exhibited a symmetry that made his mathematician's heart ache with recognition. Elena Vasquez met him at the north entrance, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her laptop bag slung over one shoulder. At 27, she was the youngest member of the resonance group, but her research had been the most explosive. Her discovery of the construction anomalies at the Panama Pacific Exposition had been what finally convinced Marcus that he was not alone in his suspicions. "I found something," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty plaza. The original construction photographs, the ones that were supposed to have been destroyed in the 1920s. She led him to a bench in the shade and opened her laptop. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of black and white images that Marcus had never seen before. The photographs showed the construction site of San Francisco City Hall, dated 1914. Workers in period clothing stood on scaffolding, their faces blurred by the long exposure times of early cameras. But something was wrong with the images, something that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The dome was already there. In every photograph, regardless of the supposed stage of construction, the great dome rose complete and perfect against the sky. The workers were not building, they were revealing. They were excavating. Layer by layer, they were uncovering a structure that had been buried beneath decades of accumulated earth and debris. "The earthquake of 1906, Elena said quietly. "The official story is that it destroyed the old City Hall. But what if it did something else? What if the earthquake exposed something that had been hidden beneath the surface, something ancient?" Marcus studied the photographs with growing wonder. He could see it now. The workers were not laying stones, they were cleaning them. They were not erecting columns, they were digging them out. The entire construction project had been an elaborate excavation, disguised as a building campaign. "But who would hide something like this?" Marcus asked. "And why?" Elena shook her head. "That is what we need to find out." Over the following months, the Resonance Group expanded their investigation to include sky domes across the entire country. William Chen traveled to Washington, D.C., where he spent 3 weeks analyzing the Capitol dome. Catherine Mills documented the mysterious architecture of the Detroit train station, the abandoned power plants of Buffalo, the forgotten exhibition halls of St. Louis. And everywhere they looked, they found the same pattern: construction photographs that did not match the official timelines, architectural features that exceeded the engineering capabilities of their supposed era, materials that could not be sourced from any known quarry or manufacturer, and most tellingly, buildings that shared geometric proportions with structures thousands of miles away, as if they had all been designed by a single mind. William Chen's findings in Washington were particularly disturbing. The Capitol dome, officially completed in 1866, exhibited structural characteristics that should not have been possible with Civil War-era technology. The cast-iron framework weighed approximately 15 million pounds, yet the foundation showed no signs of settling or stress that such a massive load would have caused over 150 years. The acoustic properties of the rotunda allowed a whisper spoken at one side to be heard clearly at the other. a feature that modern acoustic engineers struggled to explain. "I ran the numbers 3 times," William told the group during one of their video conferences. "The iron castings would have required foundry capabilities that simply did not exist in the 1860s. The precision of the curves, the uniformity of the thickness, the absence of any visible seams or joints. It is as if the entire dome was cast in a single piece, which is impossible." "Unless," Catherine Mills interjected, "it was not cast at all." Catherine had been studying the old photographs with an artist's eye for detail. She had noticed something that the others had missed: the patina. The greenish-brown oxidation that covered the dome's exterior showed wear patterns that suggested centuries of exposure, not decades. She had compared the Capitol dome to other copper structures of confirmed age and found that the oxidation layers were far deeper and more complex than the official timeline would allow. "This dome is old," Catherine said, "not 150 years old, much older. I cannot tell you exactly how old, but the evidence suggests we are looking at something ancient." The evidence continued to accumulate. Marcus discovered records of similar domes in cities across America, built during the same suspicious period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Detroit, Cleveland, Denver, Minneapolis. Each one exhibited the same impossible characteristics. Each one had construction records that were incomplete, contradictory, or suspiciously absent. And then there was the question of the world's fairs. The great expositions of that era, from Philadelphia in 1876 to San Francisco in 1915, had all featured monumental domed structures that were supposedly temporary, built of ephemeral materials and designed to last only for the duration of the fair. Yet, photograph after photograph showed buildings of stunning grandeur, with architectural details that would have taken decades to carve by hand. And in every case, when the fair ended, these magnificent structures were demolished with suspicious haste, leaving almost nothing behind. "They were hiding something," Elena said during one late-night research session. "Every time a dome was revealed, every time the public got too close to the truth, they tore it down. They erased the evidence and wrote a new story in its place." Marcus nodded slowly. The pattern was becoming clear. Across America, in city after city, a vast architectural inheritance had been systematically concealed. The great domed buildings that rose above the nation were not the product of 19th century ingenuity. They were remnants of something older, something forgotten, something deliberately erased from the memory of humanity. The question was no longer whether these buildings existed before their official construction dates. The question was, who built them, and what happened to the civilization that created them? The resonance group was about to find an answer that would change everything they thought they knew about history. There is a sound that old buildings make, not the creaking of wood or the settling of stone, but something deeper, something that resonates beneath the threshold of conscious hearing. Something that the body feels before the mind can name. Marcus Holloway heard that sound for the first time in the rotunda of the Library of Congress. He had come to Washington in October, following a lead that Elena had discovered in an obscure academic journal. The article, published in 1923 and never cited again, described unusual electromagnetic readings taken inside several government buildings. The author, a physicist named Harold Whitmore, had detected energy signatures that he could not explain, emanating from the domed structures of the Capitol. Marcus stood in the center of the great reading room, surrounded by tourists and students who moved through the space without noticing anything unusual. But Marcus noticed. He felt the low vibration in his bones, a frequency that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The dome rose above him, like the inside of a giant bell, and he understood suddenly why Whitmore had been drawn to study these buildings. They were not merely architectural achievements. They were instruments. He spent the rest of the day wandering through the building, taking readings with equipment that William Chen had provided. The electromagnetic sensors showed anomalous patterns wherever he walked. The air itself seemed charged with potential, as if the building were holding its breath, waiting for something to activate it. That evening, Marcus met with the rest of the resonance group at a small hotel near DuPont Circle. The room was cramped and smelled of old carpet, but they had chosen it specifically for its distance from any government buildings. They were becoming paranoid, perhaps, but the nature of their research seemed to warrant caution. William Chen arrived with a box of files that he had obtained from a retired archivist who had worked at the Smithsonian for 40 years. The archivist, now in his 80s and suffering from early dementia, had kept copies of documents that were supposed to have been destroyed decades ago, documents that described a catastrophic event in the mid-19th century that had been erased from all official histories. He called it the Reset, William said, spreading the papers across the bed. According to these records, something happened around 1850 that fundamentally changed the American landscape. Cities were destroyed, populations were displaced, and in the aftermath, a massive effort was undertaken to rebuild, or rather, to reoccupy structures that had survived the destruction. The documents were fragmentary and water-damaged, but the picture they painted was extraordinary. They described a civilization that had existed before the official founding of the United States. A civilization that had built the great domed structures that Marcus had been studying. A civilization that had mastered technologies far beyond anything the 19th century was supposed to possess. They called themselves the Architects, William continued. That is the only name that appears in these documents. They built structures that could harness atmospheric energy, convert it into usable power, and distribute it across vast distances without wires or generators. The domes were not just beautiful, they were functional. They were part of a global energy network that spanned the entire planet. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes wide. What happened to them? William shook his head. The documents do not say, but something catastrophic occurred, a war perhaps, or a natural disaster of unprecedented scale. Whatever it was, it destroyed the architects and buried their works beneath layers of mud and debris. The survivors, those who came after, found these structures and claimed them as their own. They invented histories to explain buildings they did not understand. They attributed construction to architects who had merely cleaned and restored what already existed. Catherine Mills had been silent throughout the presentation, but now she spoke. "The mud floods," she said quietly. "I have seen photographs of cities across America showing buildings buried to their first floors. Official explanations claim that streets were raised for sanitation purposes, but the evidence suggests something else. Something buried these cities. Something covered them in feet of sediment. And when they were dug out, the people who did the digging did not understand what they had found." Marcus thought of the photographs he had studied. The construction workers who were actually excavators. The buildings that emerged from the earth fully formed. The impossible timelines that made sense only if the structures predated their supposed construction. "The Reset," he murmured. It was not just a local event, it was global. Over the following weeks, the resonance group found evidence of similar buried structures across the world. European capitals with buildings sunk below street level, Asian cities with underground floors that predated recorded history, Australian landmarks with foundations that extended far deeper than any official survey acknowledged. The pattern was consistent, the architecture was identical, the conclusion was inescapable. A global civilization had once existed, far more advanced than anything the modern world had achieved. They had built structures that served not just as shelters, but as nodes in a planetary energy network, and something had destroyed them, buried their works, and erased their memory from human history. Marcus began to understand why this knowledge had been suppressed. If the truth were known, it would invalidate every assumption about human progress. It would reveal that modern civilization was not the pinnacle of achievement, but merely a shadow of what had come before. It would force humanity to confront the possibility that everything they believed about their past was a carefully constructed lie. But the Resonance Group had gone too far to turn back. They had glimpsed the truth, and they were determined to bring it into the light. Their next discovery would provide the key to understanding not just what the architects had built, but how their technology had worked. If this story is touching something deep inside you, if you feel that forgotten truth resonating in your soul, leave a comment right now saying, "The silence remembers what history forgot." Let me know that you are here, that you understand, that you feel what I feel. Light. The kind of light that filters through stained glass and transforms ordinary spaces into sanctuaries. The kind that seems to carry meaning beyond mere illumination. Marcus Holloway stood in the rotunda of the Minnesota State Capitol, watching the afternoon sun stream through the windows of the Great Dome above him. He had been traveling for weeks now, visiting sky domes across the country, and with each new building he visited, his understanding deepened. The domes were not decorative. They were functional. William Chen had provided him with specialized equipment to measure electromagnetic fields, acoustic resonance, and atmospheric ionization. And in every domed building Marcus tested, he found the same patterns. The structures were designed to collect and focus energy from the atmosphere, channeling it through geometric configurations that modern physics struggled to explain. "The shape is the key," William had told him during their last video call. "The parabolic curve of the dome creates a natural resonance chamber. Any acoustic or electromagnetic energy that enters the space is reflected and focused toward the center. But these domes go further. The materials, the proportions, the orientation, everything is calibrated to capture specific frequencies. Frequencies that exist in the atmosphere all around us, invisible but measurable." Marcus thought of Nikola Tesla, the Serbian-American inventor who had claimed to have discovered a method of transmitting electrical power wirelessly. Tesla had built a tower at Wardenclyffe, Long Island, that was supposed to broadcast free energy across the planet. But his funding had been cut, his tower demolished, and his research buried. What if Tesla had not invented anything at all? What if he had merely rediscovered technology that already existed, hidden in plain sight within the domed buildings of America? The more Marcus researched, the more connections he found. Tesla's patents described systems that were remarkably similar to the energy signatures William had detected in the sky domes. His drawings showed antenna configurations that matched the decorative elements found atop many 19th century buildings. His notes referenced ancient texts that described a lost civilization with power beyond imagination. Tesla had known. He had found evidence of the architects and had attempted to recreate their technology. And for his efforts, he had been discredited, impoverished, and erased from the mainstream narrative of scientific progress. Elena Vasquez arrived in Minneapolis 3 days after Marcus, carrying a laptop full of research that would transform their understanding of the sky domes. She had been investigating the Panama Pacific Exposition of 1915, and what she had found defied belief. "The Tower of Jewels," she said, spreading photographs across the hotel room desk. "The central structure of the fair, 435 feet tall, covered with over 100,000 cut-glass gems called Nova Gems. The official story is that the tower was built for aesthetic purposes, to catch the light and create a dazzling display." Marcus studied the photographs. The tower was magnificent, a soaring spire crowned with a massive sphere that seemed to glow from within. "But look at the design," Eleanor continued. "The proportions match exactly with Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower. The sphere at the top, the tapering shaft, the geometric base. It is the same configuration, and the Nova gems were not just decorative. They were piezoelectric crystals capable of converting mechanical stress into electrical energy. The entire tower was a giant energy collector, designed to harvest power from the atmosphere and distribute it across the fairgrounds. Marcus remembered the photographs of the Panama Pacific Exposition at night. The buildings had been illuminated with an ethereal glow that seemed to come from within, rather than from external sources. Contemporary accounts described the light as unlike anything the visitors had ever seen, soft and pervasive, casting no harsh shadows. "Free energy," Marcus said quietly. They were demonstrating free energy technology at a World's Fair in 1915, and then they tore it down. Elena nodded. Just like all the others. Every World's Fair, every exposition, featured similar structures. And every time, when the fair ended, the buildings were demolished with extraordinary speed. The official explanation was that they were temporary structures built of impermanent materials. But the photographs tell a different story. She pulled out another set of images showing the demolition of the Tower of Jewels. The workers were not dismantling a fragile plaster structure. They were using dynamite. They were working with urgency, as if racing against a deadline. And in the background of several photographs, men in suits watched the destruction with expressions of grim satisfaction. "Someone wanted these buildings destroyed," Elena said. "Someone powerful enough to orchestrate the demolition of architectural wonders across multiple World's Fairs. Someone who understood what these structures represented and wanted to ensure that the technology would never be understood or replicated." The conspiracy was becoming clearer. The architects had built a global network of energy-collecting structures, using the domed buildings as nodes in a planetary power grid. Something had destroyed them, buried their works, and scattered the survivors. When their buildings were rediscovered, the new rulers of the world had recognized the threat they represented and had worked to suppress the technology while profiting from the structures themselves. The sky domes that remained were the buildings that could not be demolished without attracting too much attention. State capitals, government buildings, major landmarks. They had been preserved but stripped of their functionality, converted from power stations into administrative offices and tourist attractions. But perhaps, Marcus thought, the technology was not entirely lost. Perhaps the structures still retained some of their original capability. Perhaps, with the right understanding, they could be reactivated. Catherine Mills arrived in Minneapolis with evidence that suggested exactly that possibility. She had been documenting unusual phenomena reported in and around domed buildings across the country. Strange lights, unexplained sounds, electronic equipment malfunctioning in specific locations, and most intriguingly, reports of improved health and vitality among people who spent significant time inside certain structures. "There are testimonies going back decades," Catherine said. "People who worked in the Capitol building reporting that they never got sick. Residents near certain churches describing an unusual sense of peace and well-being. Children who visited the Library of Congress showing improved concentration and memory. The patterns are consistent, but no one has ever connected them to the architecture." Marcus thought of the vibration he had felt in the Library of Congress, the low hum that seemed to resonate with his very bones. What if that sensation was not just psychological? What if the buildings were still functioning, however imperfectly, channeling energy that affected everyone who entered them? The implications were staggering. A technology that could provide free, clean energy to the entire planet. A technology that could improve human health and cognitive function. A technology that had been deliberately suppressed for over a century while humanity burned fossil fuels and fought wars over dwindling resources. The Resonance Group had uncovered a secret that could transform the world. But bringing that secret to light would require evidence that could not be dismissed or debunked. It would require proof that even the most skeptical minds could not ignore. They would find that proof in the most unexpected place, a forgotten building in the heart of Detroit. Decay. The kind of decay that transforms grandeur into melancholy. The kind that makes you wonder what glories have been lost to time and neglect. Marcus Holloway stood before the Michigan Central Station, Detroit's abandoned railway terminal, watching the autumn wind blow leaves through the broken windows of the great waiting room. The building had been closed since 1988, left to deteriorate while the city around it struggled with economic collapse and population exodus. But to Marcus, the station was not a ruin. It was a revelation. The building had been constructed in 1913, supposedly designed by the same architectural firm that had created Grand Central Terminal in New York. But where Grand Central had been maintained and celebrated, Michigan Central had been abandoned and forgotten. And in that abandonment, secrets had been preserved that more careful stewardship might have hidden. Catherine Mills had discovered the station during her documentation of American industrial architecture. She had been photographing the exterior when she noticed something unusual about the tower that rose above the main building. The proportions matched exactly with the energy-collecting structures they had been studying. The orientation aligned precisely with the cardinal directions, and most remarkably, the decorative elements that crowned the tower were not merely ornamental. They were antennae. The resonance group had arranged special access to the building through a contact in the Detroit preservation community. They would have 3 days to explore the structure before security concerns forced them to leave. Marcus entered the building through a side door, stepping over debris and fallen plaster. The interior was vast and haunted, a cathedral of transportation that had fallen silent. Pigeons roosted in the vaulted ceiling. Graffiti covered the marble walls. But beneath the damage, the original architecture remained intact. William Chen set up his equipment in the center of the waiting room, assembling sensors and monitors that would measure every aspect of the building's electromagnetic signature. Elena Vasquez documented every surface, photographing architectural details that might hold clues to the structure's original function. Catherine Mills climbed to the upper floors, searching for access to the tower that rose above. What they found over the following 3 days would confirm every theory they had developed. The building was alive. Despite decades of neglect, the electromagnetic sensors detected active energy patterns throughout the structure. The readings were strongest in the waiting room, directly beneath the central dome and in the tower above. The patterns pulsed with a regular rhythm, like a heartbeat, suggesting a system that was still functioning despite having no apparent power source. William traced the energy patterns to their source, a chamber beneath the main floor that did not appear on any official building plans. The entrance had been sealed with concrete at some point in the past, but decay had opened cracks large enough for a person to pass through. Marcus descended into the darkness with a flashlight, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. The chamber was small, perhaps 20 feet square, with walls lined with copper plates arranged in geometric patterns. At the center stood a crystalline structure that seemed to glow faintly in the beam of his flashlight, pulsing with the same rhythm they had detected above. "The heart of the building," Marcus whispered. "This is what powers everything." He photographed every surface, documented every detail, recorded measurements that would prove the structure was generating energy through means that contemporary science could not explain. The crystal at the center was unlike anything he had ever seen, its internal structure revealing patterns that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Elena joined him in the chamber, her face illuminated by the glow of her camera screen. She had been researching the construction history of the station and had found discrepancies that matched the pattern they had seen elsewhere. The building had been completed far faster than should have been possible, The foundation extended deeper than any official surveys acknowledged, and the original architects had included features that made no sense for a railway terminal. "They knew," Elena said. "Whoever designed this building understood what they were working with. They incorporated the ancient technology into the new structure, hiding it in plain sight." Catherine called down from above, her voice echoing through the building. She had found access to the tower and had discovered additional chambers containing equipment that defied explanation. Coils of copper wire arranged in precise spirals, crystals mounted on adjustable platforms, mirrors positioned to catch and redirect light in specific patterns. "It is a complete energy collection and distribution system," William said when they had gathered their findings. "The dome captures atmospheric energy. The tower amplifies and focuses it. The underground chamber stores and regulates it, and the entire building serves as an antenna, broadcasting power to anyone with a receiver tuned to the right frequency." Marcus thought of all the similar buildings across America, the domed capitals, the grand railway stations, the ornate public libraries. How many of them contained similar hidden chambers? How many of them were still generating power that no one knew how to access? "We need to go public with this," Elena said. "We have enough evidence now, photographs, measurements, documentation. We can prove that this technology exists." But Marcus hesitated. He had been thinking about the implications of their discovery, and he was not certain that revealing the truth would have the effect they hoped. "Who controls the narrative?" he asked. "We have evidence, yes, but we are 4 independent researchers with no institutional backing. The moment we go public, we will be discredited. Our evidence will be dismissed as hoaxes, our reputations will be destroyed, and the buildings will be sealed, renovated, demolished. Whatever it takes to ensure that no one else can verify what we have found." The others were silent, recognizing the truth of his words. They had uncovered a secret that powerful interests had protected for over a century. Those interests would not hesitate to protect it further. "Then what do we do?" Catherine asked. Marcus looked at the photographs on his camera, the images of technology that could transform human civilization. "We document everything," he said. "We create copies and distribute them widely. We share our findings with everyone who will listen, and we hope that the truth, once released, cannot be contained." It was a fragile hope, but it was all they had. They spent the remaining days in Detroit gathering every piece of evidence they could find. They photographed every chamber, recorded every reading, documented every anomaly, and when they left, they carried with them proof of a technology that had been suppressed for generations, evidence of a civilization that had been erased from history. The story of the sky domes was not over. It was just beginning. Memory, the kind of memory that lives not in the mind, but in the body. The kind that stirs when you stand in certain places, touch certain stones, hear certain frequencies that vibrate with forgotten meaning. 6 months had passed since the Detroit discovery. Marcus Holloway sat in his study in Boston, surrounded by documents and photographs that told a story few would believe. The Resonance Group had released their findings to the world, sharing their evidence through every channel available to them. Academic papers, documentary films, social media posts, underground networks of researchers who had been asking similar questions for years. The response had been everything Marcus feared and everything he hoped. The mainstream media had dismissed them, of course. Experts had been paraded before cameras to explain why the evidence was fraudulent, why the theories were impossible, why the researchers were deluded or dishonest. The buildings in question had been secured, access restricted, studies prohibited. But the truth, once released, had found its audience. Across the country and around the world, people had begun to look at the domed buildings in their cities with new eyes. They had started asking questions that had never been asked before. They had begun to feel the resonance that Marcus had felt in the Library of Congress, the vibration that seemed to connect them to something vast and ancient. The resonance group had grown from 4 members to 400, then 4,000. Researchers and enthusiasts who shared their findings conducted their own investigations, documented anomalies that confirmed the pattern. The network of sky domes was being mapped, building by building, city by city, country by country, and something unexpected had begun to happen. Reports came in from across the world of strange phenomena occurring in and around the domed structures. Lights flickering in patterns that seemed intentional, sounds emanating from walls that had been silent for decades, equipment registering energy signatures that grew stronger with each passing month. William Chen had a theory. "The buildings are waking up," he said during one of their conference calls. "Our investigation drew attention to them. People started visiting them, thinking about them, focusing on them, and that attention, that concentrated human consciousness, is somehow activating the dormant systems." It sounded mystical, but the data supported the hypothesis. The energy readings from the Michigan Central Station had increased by 300% since their visit. Similar increases had been reported from other buildings in their network. Something was changing, and the pace of change was accelerating. Elena Vasquez had been tracking the historical records, looking for precedents. She found them in the accounts of the world's fairs, in the descriptions of the strange lights and sensations that visitors had reported. The buildings had been active then, functioning as intended. And the crowds that had filled them, the millions of people who had walked beneath the domes and marveled at the architecture, had provided the catalyst that powered the system. "Human consciousness is part of the technology," Elena explained. "The architects understood something that modern science is only beginning to explore: the relationship between awareness and energy, between intention and physical reality. They built structures that could harness that relationship, amplifying human consciousness and converting it into usable power." Marcus thought of all the churches and temples that featured domed architecture, the mosques with their soaring minarets, the cathedrals with their vaulted ceilings. Had the builders of those structures understood the same principles? Had they been continuing a tradition that stretched back to the architects themselves? The more he learned, the more questions emerged. But one thing was becoming clear: the suppression of this technology had not been merely about controlling energy resources. It had been about controlling human potential. If the sky domes could amplify consciousness, could enhance human capability, could connect individuals to a larger field of awareness, then their suppression represented an attempt to limit what humanity could become. The architects had built a world where energy was free and abundant, where human potential was enhanced rather than diminished, where connection was the natural state and isolation was the anomaly. That world had been destroyed, buried, forgotten, but its foundations remained, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be rediscovered. Catherine Mills had been documenting the personal testimonies that poured in from around the world, stories of healing and transformation, accounts of insights and awakenings, reports of connections formed between strangers who had never met but who had visited the same buildings and felt the same resonance. "People are changing," Catherine said. "Not just their beliefs, but their actual experience of reality. They are becoming more aware, more connected, more alive, and it is happening because they are engaging with this technology, whether they understand it or not." Marcus walked to his window and looked out at the Boston skyline. The dome of the Massachusetts State House gleamed in the autumn sun, its golden surface catching the light like a beacon. He had walked past that building thousands of times without truly seeing it. Now he understood what it represented. A fragment of a lost world, a seed of possibility waiting to germinate. The story of the sky domes was not a story of the past. It was a story of the future. The technology that had been suppressed was awakening. The consciousness that had been limited was expanding. The connection that had been severed was being restored. Marcus did not know what would happen next. He did not know whether the forces that had suppressed this knowledge for so long would succeed in containing it once more. He did not know whether humanity was ready for the transformation that was coming. But he knew that the truth could no longer be hidden. The resonance had been remembered, the silence had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The architects had left their legacy in stone and copper, in crystal and light. They had encoded their knowledge in the geometry of buildings that had survived every attempt at erasure. And now, after centuries of forgetting, humanity was beginning to remember. The sky domes still stood, monuments to a civilization that had mastered the secrets of energy and consciousness. And within those domes, something was stirring, something that had been dormant for generations, something that was ready, at last, to be reborn. Marcus turned from the window and looked at the photographs spread across his desk. The great domes of America, the hidden chambers beneath them, the crystalline hearts that pulsed with energy beyond understanding. He thought of all the people who had joined the resonance group, all the researchers and seekers who were asking the same questions, feeling the same stirrings, hearing the same call. They were scattered across the world, but they were connected by something deeper than geography or language or culture. They were connected by the resonance itself, by the frequency that linked every sky dome to every other, every consciousness to every other, every moment to every other moment, in the vast continuum of existence. The architects had known this connection. They had built structures to amplify and strengthen it. And now, after centuries of separation, that connection was being restored. Marcus picked up his phone and typed a message to the resonance group. The awakening has begun. Spread the word. The sky domes remember, and so must we. He pressed send and watched the message disappear into the network, carried by invisible signals to devices around the world. He did not know who would read it or what they would do with the information. He only knew that the truth was out there now, spreading like ripples across the surface of human consciousness. The sky domes of Tartaria had been forgotten, but they had not been destroyed. The technology of the architects had been suppressed, but it had not been lost, and the potential of humanity had been limited, but it had not been extinguished. The resonance was returning, the silence was ending, and the world was about to remember what it had forgotten. Music swells. Marcus Holloway stood in his study, surrounded by evidence of a lost civilization, and he smiled. Not because the battle was over, but because it had finally begun. The truth was loose in the world, and nothing could contain it now. The sky domes had waited centuries for this moment. They had stood patient and silent while the world forgot their purpose. But they had never stopped functioning, never stopped broadcasting their signal into the atmosphere, never stopped waiting for humanity to remember. And now, at last, humanity was beginning to hear. The resonance of the ancients, the frequency of forgotten knowledge, the vibration of a world that had been buried but never destroyed. It was time to listen. It was time to remember. It was time to reclaim what had always been ours. The sky domes of Tartaria stood waiting, their secrets encoded in every curve, their power humming beneath every surface. And somewhere, in cities across America and around the world, people were looking up at those magnificent structures and feeling, perhaps for the first time, the truth that had been hidden for so long. We are not alone in history. We are not the pinnacle of achievement. We are the inheritors of a legacy so vast and so profound that its very existence threatens everything we have been taught to believe. But the truth is stronger than any lie. The resonance is louder than any silence. And the memory of what we once were is calling us toward what we might become. The sky domes remember, and now, so do we. If you watched this far, it is because this story touched something real inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can know who you are, so I can understand who really connects with the mysteries we explore on this channel. And if this story made you see the world differently, if it awakened questions you never knew you had, then please like this video and share it with someone who is ready to remember. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. There are more secrets waiting to be revealed, more buildings waiting to speak, more resonance waiting to be heard. The truth has been hidden for too long. Together, we can bring it into the light. Until the next story, until the next awakening, until the next resonance. Remember, the silence only seems eternal, but the truth echoes forever.